For this podcast, it will be important to understand the American slasher film. As will be established, the main film of focus in this chapter, The New York Ripper, Fulci 1982, emulates the slasher film in many ways, but is also a unique entry into the genre. It can be technically categorized as giallo, and whilst I have noted already in previous podcasts that obsessive adherence to such things can be tedious, or should I say tedious, I think in this case it is very important to draw a distinction. The Fulci Giallo is a very specific thing and belonged to a time and a place. His gialli are thoughtful and procedural, with violence occasionally enhancing the spectacle, but they were considered, often slow paced and always poignant. The New York Ripper does not necessarily fit this mold. It is a Fulci slasher set in America and made at the height of slasher popularity. This is an important distinction because it reflects the next stage of Fulci's evolution and, in my humble opinion, a last hurrah of greatness. I am the Italian Horror Guy, and this is the Italian Horror Guy podcast. Gauging the way in which analysts and reviewers responded to The New York Ripper is an important element of this podcast because it will establish the film as something of an outlier in two important ways. The first of which is that even those who usually willingly defend the extreme violence in Fulci's films tend to be unwilling to do the same for this particular film, while the other is that Ripper perhaps technically falls into the category of the giallo, but I consider it to be a slasher, as already mentioned. The confronting nature of Ripper's violence has tended to disguise the social commentary of the film that reflected its giallo roots, while the American settings and themes give it the feel of a slasher film. The result is a rather strange mixture of sexually motivated violence against women and males of varying degrees of power demeaning each other as they try to uncover the murderer, and a rather surprising child-oriented conclusion that inverses the usual structures of the giallo and slasher films. Many analysts and critics have concluded that Ripper is misogynistic in not only nature but also attitude. Jim Harper, for example, like so many others, is unforgiving in his appraisal of the film, saying it is undoubtedly Lucio Fulci's most notorious film and one of the more infamous titles in the Italian exploitation canon. Harper seems to equate the content of the film with Fulci's actual attitude towards women, stating, Fulci's difficult relations with the female gender are well documented, but few of his films have been quite so explicit in their disgust for women and feminine sexuality. Additionally, Harper takes literally factors that this podcast will analyze as ironies in this film, explaining, for example, that the psychological observations of a character referred to mainly as genius come across as trite and cliched, not to mention inaccurate. Taking the content of Ripper literally seems to have been a major reason why so many have disliked it, but more importantly, totally dismissed the film's ironies, instead seeing it as gratuitous and misogynistic. Following this common interpretation of Ripper, Lewis Paul claims Fulci's notoriously nasty and misogynist film becomes insulting and humiliating to women and men alike when the tale proposes that most women who do not subscribe to a standard code of appearance appear sexually wanton and therefore fair game for murdering psychopaths. Even the laughable detective is apparently more disgusted with his victims than with the predator. Ballon takes a similar view on the film. Regardless of Fulci's take on contemporary feminist issues, The New York Ripper remains a hollow, forced, uninspired effort that very few have rallied to support. The contradiction many Fulci analysts display, in my opinion, that the violence depicted in this film is somehow more unacceptable than the violence in his other films, has prevented the opportunity to consider Ripper as a significant exploration of masculine aggression towards sexually liberated women. Unfortunately, such summations of this film represent the limited understanding of its significance. The consciously excessive nature of the film is extremely confronting. However, its reputation has been constructed around the notion that the film's moral stance is somehow in support of the killer. It is crucial that this film be considered in its entirety for all of its ironies and social commentary, as it does in many respects represent the direction the horror film was taking and should be considered in relation to the slasher trends of the time. This podcast will analyze this film as a self-conscious and ironic representation of the notion of misguided and paranoid male fear of the sexualized female, something one might strongly associate with the entire slasher subgenre. Even some who support Fulci's work more broadly struggle to defend this film. As already mentioned, for example, Thrower argues The New York Ripper is Fulci's bleakest and most cynical film, skillful and suspenseful in its construction, epic and alarming in its destruction. It is also one of his best, and I don't say this lightly, allied to its strengths and the ferocious nihilism of its form, resulting in several murder scenes that present serious difficulties for impassioned defense. Thrower explains that all males are hypocritical in the film, while the killer is not at all sympathetic. His wholly self-serving, emotionally stunted rationale is condemned. Thrower notices a strange aspect of Ripper is that all the central characters are inadequate, alienated, lost souls. While there is limited support for this chapter's argument that the New York Ripper can be read in a progressive sense, Howarth, or Troy Howarth that is one of the few to have done so. Howarth felt that Fulci lost out with Ripper because so much genre criticism is so superficial and reactionary. I couldn't agree more. He explains the New York Ripper would transpose this emphasis on blood and gore into a more realistic context. What played out as over the top and operatic in the context of the supernatural world now seems sadistic and cruel. Howarth presents an impassioned defense of the film overall. Importantly, he notes that while many of the characters may be bigots and hypocrites, the viewer is always hoping for the victims to survive. Olney also felt the film had been misunderstood. Unfortunately, violence is a given in the slasher film, while phallic weaponry and the punishment of sexualized women are also extremely common tropes. Except for some rare and noteworthy exceptions that I have detailed, but something about Ripper turns people away that they accept in other slashers. This alone is the perfect justification for an extended analysis of this film. So, let's get to a plot synopsis.
Lieutenant Williams,
Speaking. What do you want?
to dedicate a killing to you. Gonna sacrifice a woman just for you.
A man is walking his dog near Brooklyn Bridge in New York when his dog finds a severed human hand in a bush. Lieutenant Williams is told by a witness that the hand's former owner is an exotic dancer, or was an exotic dancer, who had an appointment with a man who quacks like a duck. A female cyclist is brutally murdered on a ferry by an unidentified person who quacks before a coroner establishes the cyclist's murderer is a repeat offender. Williams procures the help of Dr. Davis, a psychotherapy professor, to assist with uncovering the killer's identity. A man with 2 fingers missing on his right hand, Mika Scalenda, attends a late-night sex performance in a theater on New York's 42nd Street, while a woman, Jane, in the same row also watches intently. The woman from the performance is then murdered in her change room, being stabbed in her crotch with a broken bottle. The killer calls Williams, who is in bed with a prostitute, Kitty, to taunt him for using a prostitute and that he will kill again soon. The young Faye Majors is followed from a train by Mikus and almost stabbed to death before hallucinating that she is killed by her boyfriend Peter in a movie theater. Peter visits her in the hospital after the ordeal. Jane goes to a hotel with Mikas. Post-coitus, Jane hears on the radio that a man with two fingers missing on his right hand is killing women. She escapes the room while Mikas sleeps, but the quacking killer murders her in the hallway. Mikas breaks into Faye and Peter's apartment while Peter is away and attacks her before Peter returns and Mikas escapes. The killer calls the police station to dedicate a murder to Williams. While on the phone, he kills Kitty with a razor blade. Mikas is found dead soon after, and the coroner establishes he died before Kitty was murdered. Faye goes to see Susie, a dying little girl in a hospital who has been effectively abandoned by her parents. An ambiguous phone call between the little duck and either Faye or Peter leads to Faye stabbing Peter. After initially seeming deceased, Peter rises, speaking in the duck voice, and attempts to kill Faye. Williams and Davis arrive, and Williams shoots Peter in the head, killing him. Davis explains that to Peter, the duck became a kind of outside avenger for his daughter, who would never become like other women. Susie attempts to call her father and cries in her hospital bed as the film concludes. Very bleak indeed. Ripper is quite clearly a conscious attempt at making an American slasher film as opposed to a slasher film made by an Italian. As Becerra discusses, imitation films hid the national traits, and without a strong director's name, they would pretend to be American. Indeed, with the success of the slasher films at the time, the Italian horror film had to quickly adapt with emerging subgenres and cycles. So, furthering his work, that was discussed in the previous podcast, which has American settings but an uncanny gothic feel, Ripper is a blatant attempt to appear American. By this point, 1982, the tropes of the genre had already been well and truly established, and Fulci recognized these tropes, as is reflected in his film. Considering Fulci's regular tendency of setting his films in America and the fact his later films he often even tried to emulate and the fact that in his later films he often even tried to emulate American films, it seems only logical that understanding the cycle, structure, and themes of the American slasher film will help this episode of the podcast to analyze Fulci's work more effectively. So, let's briefly consider Robin Wood's hugely influential article, An Introduction to the American Horror Film. This can provide context for the type of film Fulci created with New York Ripper. Wood offers a number of observations about the nature of the American horror film in the context of its evolution at the time. It is worth noting that 1979, when the article was written, was just before the slasher film became popular. Wood describes repression as one of the aspects of the American slasher film. One might perhaps define repression as fully internalized oppression, while reminding ourselves that all the groundwork of repression is laid in infancy. Wood elaborates on what exactly is repressed, that is, sexual energy itself, together with its possible successful sublimation into non-sexual creativity, sexuality being the source of creative energy in general. The ideal is as close as possible to an automation in whom both sexual and intellectual energy has been reduced to a minimum. Otherwise, the ideal is a contradiction in terms and a logical impossibility, hence the necessary frustration, anxiety, and neuroticism of our culture. That's all from Wood. Indeed, Peter Bunch in Ripper lives in a world of frustration, which initially seems exclusively because of a hatred of sexually promiscuous women. Wood describes of the particularly severe repression of female sexuality and creativity, the attribution to the female of passivity, and her preparation for her subordinate and dependent role in our culture. This describes the actions of Peter almost to perfection. So, to summarize his actions throughout the film, it could be said that the level of severity of his murders seems to be directly proportionate to their level of sexual freedom and creativity. This leads to the film to a crucial point of analysis: children, as the killer's motivation is revealed to be that his young daughter will not live to be an adult due to a rare illness. Much like the fact that the killer is only revealed to have a daughter very late in the film, children are something of an afterthought in the context of society's various forms of oppression. As Wood notes, when we have worked our way through all the other liberation movements, we may discover that children are the most oppressed section of the population. Most clearly of all, the otherness of children is that which is repressed within ourselves, its expression therefore hated in others. In Ripper, it is childishness itself that governs Peter's actions, given his hatred of sexual activity and his desire to punish those who engage in it, returning them to a state of desexualized passivity. Endless violence is an unavoidable part of the slasher film, as Kendrick considers the slasher film in the context of Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left. Kendrick argues that violence is an unending cycle that solves nothing. Indeed, in this film, New York Ripper, the villains are eventually killed by the parents. In fact, I will clarify, indeed, in The Last House on the Left, the villains are eventually killed by the parents of one of their victims. But as Kendrick points out, they end the film clearly defeated and not victorious. Ripper dwells far longer than Last House does after the villain is subdued. The immediate threat to Faye is over, yet the horror continues quite explicitly as Peter's daughter is now left to die alone without her father and presumably now not even with the support of an extremely traumatized Faye. Like Last House, the horror of the film goes well beyond the violence. In Ripper, all the violence is fed through the blatant misogyny of Peter, but is implied to have come from an equally misogynistic culture. This is a culture that abandons a young child and fails to support a young and traumatized woman. The killer in Ripper is never definitively established to have had a traumatic upbringing, while his actions in fact have a detrimental impact on a child, his daughter. In this way, Ripper can be seen to differentiate from other slasher films, as children are generally totally excluded from the genre, apart from killers who have had traumatic upbringings and flashbacks to those experiences. If the streets of New York create a sense of fear in the film, it is the domestic sphere that makes this fear literal. As Gill explains, slasher films covertly engage in odd nostalgic yearning for a traditional family and traditional family values. She goes further, explaining that slasher films seem to delight in undoing the happy domestic scenes and comfortable, safe communities of that television era. Ripper only begins to portray this domesticity very late on. A very television-esque score plays at the outside of Faye and Peter's apartment, which creates a sense that this is a very idyllic little place. A great irony of the film is that initially it presents itself as the big, scary city that is unsafe, with the initial discovery happening in such a metropolitan place, yet the film slowly reveals the true horror of the film to have come from domesticity. But there is something even darker going on in Ripper that you do not always see in the slasher genre. Yes, annoying and frankly dislikable teenage characters have long defined the genre, but they are essentially harmless, misguided young teens. In Ripper, just about every single character, or at least the male ones, are total bastards. The film wants us rooting for none of them. It wants every male to feel like a threat. In fact, it is arguable that the authority figures and older characters more generally set the tone for a kind of attitude the killer exhibits. There is never a flashback or even a direct reference to a troublesome upbringing, but the quacking while Peter murders and his almost non-existent relationship with his daughter insinuates a perverse relationship with childhood. He hates that she is ill, so he ignores her, showing basically no care. She is left to fend for herself, much like the grown-up women in the film. If it is not the authorities that directly it is. Scratch that bit. Now let's move on to the topic of punishment of sexual freedom. Ripper establishes from the earliest possible point that men consider themselves superior to women in the film. Although the man walking his female dog in the very first moments of the film does not treat her badly, it is noteworthy that he is her master, playing a game of fetch and him dictating things to her immediately establishes a hierarchy in this film. This hierarchy quickly devolves into a problematic one. We're then introduced to Lieutenant Williams, who is investigating the murder of the dancer. Williams is gathering information from the slightly obnoxious landlady of the victim, Miss Weisberger, but treats her with contempt. Miss Weisberger informs him that she heard the victim talking to an unidentified person on the phone and sounded kind of like a duck. Despite this being crucial information, Williams sneers at her like a duck before insinuating she is a gossip and dismissing her from his office. From this moment, the misogynistic nature of the film's male characters has been set. While I am clearly strongly in favor of the moral standpoint of the film, I acknowledge the depiction of extreme violence is quite confronting. Seemingly, part of the reason this film has ostracized so many viewers is that the violence is so confronting, extreme, and inescapable. The first murder we witness is of a young cyclist, Rosie, who has just crashed into a stationary car. Despite her attempts to apologize to the male driver, he tells her, "You women should stay at home where you belong," and that she has the brains of a chicken. This moment helps to set the scene for the rest of the film, as this otherwise inconsequential person demonstrates the misogyny that becomes a constant. Soon after, Rosie finds the same person's car empty and attempts to exact some revenge by writing a profanity on the windscreen with her lipstick, a symbol of femininity, no less. But as she does so, the killer enters the car, somewhat poignantly as a point of view shot. The shot is uncomfortably close to Rosie, and after we hear some rather muffled words in the soon to be recognizable dark voice, the killer quickly gazes at Rosie's exposed legs before revealing a knife in his hand. Due to the nature of the film so far and our knowledge of the genre, we understand Rosie is about to die. However, after a number of failed attempts from the girl to escape, the sound of her screaming, and a standard cutaway shot, we expect our own horror to be spared. Usually, slasher films let our imaginations do at least some of the heavy lifting, but the camera quickly cuts back to Rosie, and we are witness to extreme close-ups of the murder. The killer goes beyond merely stabbing the girl as he slices her skin over and over until her intestines are exposed. The early stages of Ripper have made clear that this is not just about violence against women or even the normal attack on the female body seen in the slasher film. This is about the destruction of their body and sexuality. It is the all-encompassing nature of the misogyny and misogynistic violence that makes the film so disturbing. Lowenstein makes the observation that Robin Wood was wrong to claim the horror of the time was only about monsters threatening normality, but correct in claiming they confuse the boundaries of normal and monstrous. Interestingly, Ripper achieves both of these things simultaneously while also challenging the very notion of normal. It does so without breaking the traditional slasher mold of the psychotic killer who targets mainly females with penetrative weapons, as noted by Christensen. Ripper blurs the kinds of characters who engage in sexual activity with a mixture of prostitutes, psychopaths, misogynists, and regular people, amongst others. The film in some way celebrates sexual freedom, even if some of the male characters resent, punish, or are indifferent to this freedom. For example, when Dr. Davis agrees to assist on the case, he explains he will need to see all the data and wait for the killer to butcher another girl in a totally emotionless way. Soon after, Mika Scalenda is introduced from a point of view shot on a New York night on 42nd Street. We see what he sees, many flashing lights and advertisements for live sex shows. He is literally looking for sex. Eventually, his eyes lock onto a much smaller man who passes him a flyer. We then see this rather sinister looking right hand of his, which is missing two fingers, before seeing his face. He looks over his shoulder multiple times, giving the sense he is doing something unfavorable, and he is noticeably alone. Mikas then enters the theatre or enters a theatre and sits down in the same row as a woman, Jane, in a seemingly hazardous place for a woman to be. Jane, as becomes increasingly clear as the film progresses, is intrigued by mysterious men and potentially dangerous situations. In the scene that ensues, two women are of particular note: Jane and the live female sex show performer, Eva. The scene in question sees Eva conduct an intense sexual performance with a male partner, in which she is largely shown in the dominant top position. While they perform, Jane masturbates and regularly looks towards Mikas as she does so. Both Jane and Eva are in control of their own bodies and are displaying sexual freedom. Significantly, this scene lays a foundation for the way women act in the film. Despite the inevitable punishment, Ripper shows women engaging in sexual freedom. This is strongly emphasized by the actresses who play Jane and Eva. Jane is played by Alexandra Delicoli, who also played the part of damsel in distress, of the part damsel in distress, part anointed queen of the cannibals in the absurd zombie holocaust directed by, I believe, Marino Girolami in 1980, who is tied naked to a large rock, that is Alexandra Delicoli, with her legs and arms outstretched. Despite being the queen of the cannibals, but despite being the queen, the cannibals grant her no freedom over her body. Zora Kerova, who plays Eva, on the other hand, plays Pat in the infamous Cannibal Ferox, directed by Umberto Lenzi in 1981. The cannibals force hooks through her breasts, and she is left to hang until she dies. Therefore, both actresses are noted for their lack of control over their own bodies. And given both were Italian horror films and made not long before Ripper, many viewers would recognize them as sexually oppressed characters. In a manner truly representative of the slasher film, the sexual freedom displayed by these women is, of course, punished. As Trenkansky notes, slasher films have always drawn criticism from their victimization of or for their victimization of women, especially given their sexual activity is so regularly punished. As Carol Clover discusses both in relation to Psycho and later films in the much more formed slasher cycle, the killer must kill women who arouse him sexually. It must be noted that Ripper takes sexuality a step further than most other slasher films. While there is always potential arousal for the viewer in these films due to the nudity and sexual relations, Ripper at times is something much more like pornography. The sex performance scene is very intense. Jane and Eva can be heard making sexual exclamations, and the longer the scene goes, the shorter the cuts are from one image to the next. These images get steadily more explicit as well, from Jane's quivering lips to close-ups of Eva's body, and eventually Jane putting her hand between her legs. Rather than the typical throwaway nudity of the slasher film, this scene is designed to be arousing for the viewer as well, especially when one considers there is literally an aroused audience member watching the show. At the completion of the performance, Eva returns to her change room. She attempts to turn on the light, but the bulb has been removed, and she then steps on its broken remains on the floor. A close-up of her foot showing blood and multiple glass shards is highly uncomfortable before a noise draws her to a dresser. An unidentified hand holding a broken bottle eventually shoots out from the dresser. Some sharp music is then combined with the now recognizable dark impersonation of the killer, and he stabs the bottle into Eva's crotch. She screams loudly as the duck noises continue. A large amount of blood dripping down her legs can be seen. The sequence eventually draws to an end as Eva drops to the floor, dead, and the bottle is thrown onto the floor next to her. An extended shot of her body shows her arms spread out, her legs wide open, her upper body covered in a white robe, her bare legs covered in blood, and a larger pool of blood between them. It is a truly sickening image. A woman who has just displayed a large degree of sexual freedom has been instantly punished by an assailant who, presumably, witnessed her performance. The film simply never allows a moment of reflection for the audience to escape its morally challenging subject matter. Having already depicted a number of male characters with troubling attitudes towards women, Lieutenant Williams would usually be our moral compass, but he is no traditional hero. In fact, he really is no hero at all. He is shown with a prostitute, Kitty, who is played by Fulci regular Daniele Doria, having been murdered post-coitus in 3 previous Fulci films, 2 of which were depicted as generic clandestine youthful sexual encounters in City of the Living Dead and The Black Cat, both in 1981. She is automatically associated with youthful sexual freedom, and indeed its punishment. But there is nothing freeing about sleeping with an aging and disrespectful Williams. Kitty answers him coyly about whether anyone knows her. About when anyone knows he sleeps with her. Williams responds by calling her a dumb bitch. Williams thus considers himself superior to Kitty, and the audience is further ostracized from any possible identification with this male lead character. So is Fulci taking a cynical view of the aftermath of the sexual revolution? Well, I think yes, in a sense. With sexual freedom, at least in New York, came live sex shows. With live sex shows and very limited access to pornography came the kinds of people who were unashamed to be in attendance in such places, people like Mika Scalenda. If normalizing sex work leads to more sex workers, the kiddies of the world will find themselves with people like Williams or worse. Self-evidently, this is not a justification of men acting like pigs, more an acknowledgement that plenty of them will. Ripper seems to understand this, so cynical to be sure. But how about the return to good old family values? Well, not so fast. The family unit. To this point in the film, most characters are seen to be self-interested and there's no possibility of intimacy or a family unit has been revealed, or no family unit has been revealed as yet. As such, the sudden introduction of a family-oriented Faye is rather jarring. In a study of gender interpretations of slasher films, Nolan and Ryan explain that in contemporary American culture, females are more involved in maintaining intimacy in family affairs. They both conclude from their study that male viewers of horror films are more fearful of rurality, while female viewers have a greater fear of images connected with family terror. Stopping short of suggesting Ripper is attempting to engage with such studies and perceptions, it is nonetheless a self-aware film, as displayed by Faye's hallucination in the cinema. Faye is first shown on an uncommonly unpopulated New York train. In fact, it appears to only be occupied by her and Mikas. To this point, the film has largely directed blame for the murders towards him, both circumstantially and even through the investigations of other characters. And yet the scene that unfolds slightly contradicts this. After Mick approaches Faye and attempts to corner her, she escapes the train through an open door. After Faye is stabbed in the leg, she stumbles into an empty movie theater. There is a certain domestic quality to this theater, given we can hear a movie playing that contains children's voices. After a few moments, a hand attacks her from under her seat before Peter, who the audience has actually not yet been introduced to, stabs her to death. The most interesting element of this scene is that the threat to her seems initially directly related to her isolation, an isolation completely unrelated to her domesticity. And yet, Faye's fear and depression is directly linked to domesticity in the form of Peter. Peter is an uncommon type of killer in the slasher film. He does not align with the almost supernatural Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger types. He feels and looks much more like a real person. It is strongly implied that Peter had a traumatic upbringing that specifically taught him women were lesser than men. He seemingly tries to escape his own upbringing, but ultimately fails. At one point, he tells the police he would not be so infantile as to let himself be caught, ironically, as he is playing a rather childish game with them, teasing them that they cannot catch him while talking like a duck. However, this childishness is then contrasted with his very sickening treatment of women as he proceeds to murder Kitty the prostitute immediately after the mockery. In this scene, Kitty is completely naked as he slices her to death with a razor blade, cutting first through one of her eyes and then through a nipple. This destruction of sexuality, combined with the standard quacking, demonstrates the simultaneous childish but hateful attitude he carries towards women. Later in Ripper, when Peter leaves the house, Faye smiles before her face drops upon him leaving. A loud and sudden violin-created audio cue informs the audience that this expression is a sinister one. By this point, the only logical conclusion to the film is that Faye or Peter must be the killer. Thus, our suspicions, combined with the audio cue, confirm that it must indeed be Faye. So powerful is this cue that it in fact dictates the audience ignores the narrative logic. That by this stage it should be obvious Faye is attempting to keep up a facade to Peter that their relationship is pleasant and caring, when we know that this is not true. Soon after this cue, we are misled again. Peter picks up a ringing phone and a voice says, "This is the little duck. How are you? We haven't played in such a long time." After a brief cutaway scene to Williams and Dr. Davis, we see a close-up of Peter's eyes, hear the words "bye-bye" in the same voice as before. We then cut to Faye, who is holding another phone and once again has a sinister look on her face. Before the viewer has a chance to process what has most likely happened, Peter rushes upstairs, screaming for Faye to stay out of Susie's room. When he reaches the top, Faye stabs him with the same knife as has been used throughout the film, twice in the torso region. The shot is very visually similar to the previous murders, and this is presented as the revelation that Faye is the killer. However, the significant repeated audio cue of the quacking duck, most specifically the idea it belongs to the killer, naturally misleads the viewer into assuming the voice belongs to an adult, despite it sounding like that of a child. This is the destruction of the family unit. Confusion, deception, violence. There are moments when the film misleads us into thinking this is the one safe haven in the film. That away from late night sex shows, New York subways, and sleazy bars, we could at least feel a sense of calm and ease at home. But indeed, this is not the case. In a way, the horror of this film is based entirely on the breakdown of the family unit. After all, it is Peter's inability and unwillingness to father his sick child that forms the basis of violent intent. Society is unsafe when family as a concept is shattered. That seems to be Fulci's point. So, the final girl and family. Ripper might not be a normal slasher, but it is a slasher nonetheless. The final girl trope has become ubiquitous in analysis of the genre, having been discussed in academia at great length. Ripper does indeed contain a final girl character, but her story arc is quite unique. In fact, while the film strongly adheres to genre conventions such as the unidentified killer, the use of phallic weaponry, and the punishment of sexually active women, it is the ode to and breaking away from these concepts that makes Ripper so unique and its conclusion so poignant. The final girl trope was first defined by Carol Clover. This is where Ripper can be analysed as both reminiscent of Halloween and in the conventions of the slasher genre, while also branching away from those, which results in the very uncommon depiction of a traumatized child. First, a definition and understanding of the final girl is in order, as Clover wrote. She is the one who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror and of her own peril, who is chased, cornered, wounded, whom we see scream, stagger, fall, rise, and scream again. She is abject terror personified. If her friends knew they were about to die only seconds before the event, the final girl lives with the knowledge for long minutes or hours. She alone looks death in the face, but she alone also finds the strength either to stay the killer long enough to be rescued or kill him herself. But with such heroism comes great cost. Women are victimized and punished far more frequently than men in the genre. Ripper contains far more blatant sexual violence than most slasher films, to the extent that this is a film fundamentally about misogyny, as opposed to the more occasional depiction of misogyny in these films. Ripper takes the notion that virgins are less likely to be punished in slasher films to the extreme, given that as a general rule in the film, women seem to be at their most vulnerable when sexually active. Faye, on the other hand, is depicted much more conservatively, as her character arc revolves around maternal instincts and domestic life, while the film never insinuates sexual activity in her day-to-day life. This is at least a strong contrast to the other female characters in the film. Given the characters Peter dispatches with so easily are generally marked by sexuality, or at least the sexuality Peter sees in them, it could be argued Faye's lack of displayed sexuality is what makes her harder to kill, at least in a symbolic sense, in the context of the genre itself. Faye is the film's final girl, and in some ways she fits the mold outlined by Clover. Introduced somewhat jarringly near the halfway point of the film, Faye is not necessarily sexually inactive and is certainly not afraid to talk to boys in the way Laurie Strode was, but can also be characterized as the bookworm character, given Peter reveals she has an IQ of 182. She has achieved well at university, and her last name, Majors, even seems like a code for a high-achieving student. Faye does ultimately have a similar character arc to Laurie in Halloween, as she most certainly must face the killer and physically defeat him before relying on a male rescuer to ultimately save her life. There are, however, several key adjustments. Christensen argues that Clover's final girl is actively anti-feminist, explaining that because Laurie relies on a male savior, she is hardly a bastion of feminist self-empowerment. He goes further, stating that Laurie actually resembles the ideal of the cult of true womanhood: purity, piety, domesticity, and submissiveness. Faye can be read in this way as well. Despite the possibility of competing at the upcoming Olympics, Faye is much more excited to get home to Peter after a traumatic ordeal. She tells him she simply wants to take it easy and get some love and understanding. Despite them both being high-achieving people outside of home life, it is quite noticeable late in the film, when Faye makes dinner for the two of them, that Peter disappears off to study. Faye is left in a small kitchen in which the fridge, two walls, and the camera appear to be trapping her inside. A close-up of her head, within which the foreground places a set of steak knives right next to, seems to imply that this domestic space is downright threatening, certainly given what knives have already done to the female body in this film so far. The audience is naturally fearful for her at this point, as is always the case with my apologies, with the final girl. Nonetheless, there is a brief moment where we believe Faye is the aggressor. After a phone call between the killer and Susie, Peter is stabbed by Faye, seemingly to death, but Peter springs to life again, now as the dark persona, and the reveal ensues. You're like the rest of them, young, beautiful, and healthy, while I rot to death in bed in a lousy, sticking hospital. Williams appears with Davis and shoots this new persona dead. The dark voice is in fact Peter's Susie persona, in which he acts as something of an avenger for his daughter, killing exactly what she will never be, a fully grown and matured woman. Despite the belated intervention from our male heroes, Faye deserves all the credit. She recognizes the source of Peter's monstrosity, which is not in fact his daughter, but his lack of parenting. As Davis later explains, he never realized that a little affection was all she asked for her to bear the tragedy of her condition. Faye naturally recognizes this lack of nurturing from the way Peter treated her earlier, having told him she likes coming home with him and being cuddled and comforted. But Peter simply says she needs to focus on her training. In this country, if you're not good at something, at anything, if you're not the best, you're screwed. Faye is therefore able to identify with this monstrosity as she has experienced it herself, while Williams comes to the rescue of Faye, much like Loomis does Laurie in Halloween. Faye uncovers everything herself, entirely independent of Williams, who simply kills the other persona. Faye is the mother figure, even if not Susie's real mother. She is the hero based on her brave actions, and she is an uncommon final girl. This is because she does not have to become masculinized to be heroic. Yes, she turns the phallic weapon on her attacker, but she does not step out of her maternal domestic status. Apart from Faye, Ripper largely eschews the depiction of maternal women, which renders the depiction of sexually liberated women as something of a banality at stages in the film rather than a transgression. Of course, these women are punished on many occasions, but the final explanation definitively proves the moral stance of the film. Faye's heroism is represented in her care for Susie. Indeed, her unheeded request of Peter to provide her some care, love, and understanding reveals her true nature. So forgotten about is Susie that her existence is not even revealed until the latter stages of the film. Her final showdown with Peter and her failure to stab him to death are facts that is not Susie, indeed, that is Faye. Faye's final showdown with Peter and her failure to stab him to death are facts that do not, in fact, prevent her from being heroic. They simply conclude the theme of male violence and female victimhood. While the intervention of Williams literally saves Faye's life, he has partaken in the misogyny for the length of the film. Violence is not merely perpetrated by Peter, but of the entire male presence in the film. Williams repeatedly mocks women. Davis refers to frigid women as having something wrong with them. The coroner uses the term shoved it up her joy trail, and a totally inconsequential man tells a soon-to-be murder victim that you women should stay home where you belong. In short, the treatment of women by men in this film is disgraceful. Faye is the only character to show any care for the sick child, which is not even her own. As the film concludes with Susie sobbing, it becomes clear she is the ultimate victim of the film. She gets no love from her father, just as no women received any from anyone good or received anything good from men in the entire film. Susie is ignored and basically abandoned. Even the film neglects to acknowledge her until nearly the end. This is the darkest side of this particular slasher film. The lasting image is a final girl of a different kind, a lonely little girl dying in a hospital bed, which the world does not care about. Daddy, please answer, she says over the phone, but of course, no one does. Many killers and a great deal of trauma are born out of childhood experiences in the slasher, but it is very uncommon for the child itself to be the ultimate victim of all the carnage. The slasher film of the 1980s was structured to challenge family values in an era where family values were strongly reinforced. Where Ripper goes a step further is that the concept of family is barely touched upon at all, while a little girl is the ultimate victim because of the lack of care and love she receives. Susie is marked by what she misses out on, riding bikes like Rosie, driving sports cars like Jane, or even competing in the Olympics like Faye. While the murders of the women are brutal, they have adult freedom leading up to their deaths at least. There is an impression of lives well lived. Susie, on the other hand, is forgotten about almost by the film itself. She is referred to only briefly in the first 75 minutes of the film and only introduced in the latter stages. After the police and ambulance sirens blaze at the end of the film, the camera cuts back to a defeated Susie, now sobbing uncontrollably. The camera almost cruelly zooms in on her face before fading away to another street, and the now recognizable sound of the crime drama sounding main theme drowns out the sound of her tears. The New York streets and the theme music shows total indifference to the little girl. Susie is yet another Fulci victim.